Hello dear chess lovers, today I will show you 6 patterns every accelerated dragon player must know. We are playing against the Maroczy Bind. For those players who are facing the Maroczy Bind, which is characterized by these 2 pawns in the center versus the pawn on d6, we are learning how to play these positions with the black pieces. It can come from English opening, Sicilian, accelerated dragon, and so on. There are many different transformations to achieve a similar structure. So that's a universal setup for black. Thus, the frequency of occurrence is high. So these patterns I will show you today will be very useful for you, both for black or with white pieces too. Pattern number 1, folks. We are lacking space as black, don't you see? The pawn on e4 and c4 is giving so much space to white. There are still 4 minor pieces left on the board, which means there's a little traffic jam going on in black's camp. That's exactly why this is called bind, Maroczy bind. White is basically having a bind in the position. It's difficult to play d5 and so on, okay? So, if you're lacking space, what should we do in general? Trade some minor pieces, and that's the first pattern to remember. Knight takes d4 is a very typical move in these structures. We exchange one pair of minor pieces, but there's one more idea behind this move. The c6 square has been vacated for which piece? You tell me. Yes, bishop c6, a very typical follow-up to knight takes d4, okay? So this is the pattern you must know as accelerated dragon players or when you're playing against the Maroczy Bind. Take, followed by bishop c6. Why? 2 ideas. The bishop puts pressure in the center, fights against knight d5, but there is one more point actually. There are 3 points, and we are coming there very soon in the second pattern. We came to the second pattern, folks. In this position, white played the move knight d5. Now, please stop the video. If you've never seen similar patterns before, think for yourself in this position. What should black play? How do you negotiate this tension between those pieces on the center of the board? You're a great player, folks, if you came up with the move knight d7. Another point of the move bishop c6. This bishop c6 move vacated the d7 square for the knight, and you're offering an exchange of those bishops. This is a second pattern you must know in those structures. Why is this trade a good trade for black? You tell me, folks. You tell me. First reason is space. By exchanging of those minor pieces, we are solving our space problem, right? Second of all, this king cannot be attacked. White's pieces in no position to attack and mate the black king. So this defensive bishop can disappear. Okay? More on that later on. Finally, dark squares. Dark square play becomes black's. Black is a dream. Have a dream of having a good knight versus a bad bishop scenario. And those dark squares will be very handy for your knight. For example, already here, you see this dark square on c5 for the knight. It can dominate this terrible light square bishop for white. Very important thing to understand. If you decide to take the knight in this position, which is the third pattern to remember, that's a big mistake, because after e takes d5, you're creating a weakness on e7. Very typical pawn transformation, usually favors white in those structures, folks. Thus, this will be a premature trade of that knight. Many players go wrong here, as you can understand, right? Many players blindly take that knight, but they're only helping those rooks. They will double up on the e-file, and your e7 pawn is forever going to be a liability for you, right? It's already visible from this position, evident from this position, that this weakness is only helping white. So you help them by taking that knight prematurely. So we are coming to the third pattern, folks. They take on g7, we take back, and white plays the move rook e3. A very typical idea. First things first, what is the opponent's idea here after rook e3? What do they want? What is their next move? Yes, folks, they want to play rook h3 and queen h6 invasions. Now you're learning a pattern of building sense of danger. But black has several defensive resources, folks. Don't get scared, okay? In this position, don't get scared. Again, bishop takes d5 is a very bad move, because after e takes d5, you're still having this issue on e7. This knight will be chased away with f4, and white is putting pressure on the e7 pawn. That's a bad move. But there is one move that you must know here. If you've never seen this pattern before, it might be an invisible idea for you. Black to play. You're a great player, folks, if you come up with the move e5. It looks like a chess crime at first sight. I mean, right, we are creating a backward pawn on d6. We are creating an outpost on d5. What is going on here? What is the point of e5? Now you tell me. You verbalize this very strong and typical pattern in those structures. First things first, you're locking down this diagonal. The queen cannot harass your king. Second of all, maybe more importantly, you're creating great play on those dark squares. You're controlling those dark squares now with your pawns. Look at this. The knight can later jump to c5, e6 and d4. You're creating the d4 outpost for your knight. You're preparing for great knight versus terrible bishop endgames with this move. The bishop is already exchanged, so you can easily play the move e5, right? Imagine if there's a bishop on this diagonal, e5 will be a true crime. But after the bishop trade, e5 becomes a very, very nice pattern, folks. You're also opening up your queen just in case. Multi-purpose, recurrent pattern. Now comes the fourth pattern. They go rook h3, folks. You tell me, how should black fight against white's idea? Well, white's idea is this. They want to mate us in two moves, right? So, how do you deal with this idea? Yes, folks, we go h5, a very typical defensive idea, and everything is safe for black. This rook is misplaced and this bishop sucks. The knight looks impressive, but any point I can take that knight on d5 right now. And white's attack is not going anywhere in this position. For example, after knight e3, we see a very, very interesting move from Grishuk against Kramnik, rook h8. That's very super cautious and super safe move. Black is completely fine, in fact, slightly better. But there's also the move knight c5, a very typical move that puts pressure on the e4 pawn. Just to consolidate this idea for you once again, black in this position takes on d4, and comes the next moment. You tell me, folks, which pattern did you learn and can you apply it? Yes, e5 is a beautiful move this time. Who cares about the d5 outpost because white has no knights left in this position. No knight can become a hero on d5 and we are leaving white with a terrible bishop. Plus, the second point of e5 is you're preparing this knight d4 sortie. You're creating this amazingly beautiful d4 outpost for your knight. And now, great knight versus terrible bishop scenario has been created. Rook d5 is a big mistake because this actually creates a double threat of takes and queen g5, and white is lost. For example, queen g5 and this idea, double threat, right? Double threat, white is no defense. If they defend like this, then comes knight h3 anyways, and the knight starts showing their teeth. The fifth pattern, folks, a very typical knight versus bishop position, black to play. Black to play, please formulate a good plan for black in this position. You're a great player if you came up with a minority attack plan a4, stock standard idea in those structures. By playing a4, we are creating a weakness on the queen side. Look at this. Right now, there is no clear target for us to attack. After a4, inevitably, white is giving us a target. If they take, look at those pawns. Weak pawn as well. Two weak pawns has been created and this knight is becoming hero on c5. Look at this. By this pawn transformation, no white pawn can appear on b4 anymore and your knight is cemented as a great piece too. So this minority attack plan, rolling your 2 pawns versus 3 pawns, is also extremely typical and strong Maroczy Bind idea for black in several structures. In those dragons, early dragons, accelerated dragon structures, black always has this plan later in the middle game. And the sixth pattern, which is also very typical, is to achieve such a late middle game position where you have a dominating knight versus bishop. But if there are queens on the board, that's even better for us, right? Why? Because queen and knight are great attacking combo. They are great attacking duo, right? So in this position, I will show you a very typical way for black to make progress using those two beautiful pieces. This bishop sucks, right? Like the most terrible bishop, and that's a recurrent pattern theme in those structures. That also you should know. Here, despite material equality, black king is much safer and black goes h4. A very typical way to, let's say, gain more ground on those dark squares, right? Just to soften those structures. Very typical. White takes on h4. Now, can you transfer this knight to freshly created weakness on f4? Because that's what happens. By taking on h4, they are creating this f4 weak square. And the knight starts jumping towards that side, folks. Look at this. It can go to d4, it can go to f4. There are several choices for this knight. And see how white is suffering in defending this position. It's a joy to play with black. The knight starts hopping around. It can hop here, hop there. There are so many ideas. And white is already paralyzed in passive defense, right? It's a beautiful game between Tukmakov and Velimirovich. It's one of those model games in those accelerated dragon structures. And here comes black's combination, folks. It's black to play. It looks like everything is well guarded for white. But the problem for white is this queen is overworked. If you allow queen takes f3 check, the bishop might also be dropping. So, does this give you an idea of a move for black in this position, folks? Yes, you're a great player if you found the move knight takes h4. That's what I mean. Knight and queen combo. If you take my knight, then this happens and black is completely winning. You can even trade the queens and win this pawn endgame with an extra pawn. It's a disastrous position, folks. Knight takes h4, everything is hanging. White king is not so safe. No queen trade, of course, right? Why do we trade the queens? If you trade the queens, then you're helping their king. Queen f6. The same problem. If you take my knight, this happens. Then I grab the bishop. Black is completely winning in this position, folks. But if the knight cannot be taken, the knight just returns back. And after queen e1, queen d4, queen centralization, look at the dominating black pieces. That's how you will win those late middle games, early end games, using your queen and knight combo. And here actually white will resign very, very soon. Yeah, king g2, allowing queen takes f4. White was disgusted from this position. It's a depressing position to play for white, and they resigned here. So folks, these were the 6 very typical patterns in those structures that will make you a better player when you're playing against the Maroczy Bind. As I said, this can come from knight f3 c5, this can come from symmetrical English structures, this can come from Sicilian defense. There are different transformations to the same structure. For example, here, Kramnik Grishuk, we are coming it from English systems basic, right? We achieve the same setup from English, hence the universality of this setup for black, hence the high chance of occurrence. Remember, this was the first pattern. You take and you go to c6 with the bishop. Why? Because you're preparing this while also hitting on e4 while trading a minor piece to solve your space problem, right? What was the point of a5? a5 is hinting already at potential knight d7 to c5 ideas and also creating one little target on the queen side if white ever pushes b3. And now we will reach the same structure from Sicilian defense move order, right? Look at this. Black is playing the Sicilian. Well, they want to go for dragon structures. Let's say accelerated dragon this time. Yeah, instead of knight f6, they go g6 directly. And this allows, right? The drawback of this setup is it allows white to play c4. And here we go. Maroczy Bind is on the board. But since we know the universal plans in those structures, it's still becoming nice for black to play. You can apply the patterns I told you today. For example, right? We are lacking space. We are taking on d4. The bishop is later coming to c6. Look at this. Different move orders, same ideas. Pieces are placed on the same squares. What is the move here for black? Well, there are a couple of ideas. Knight d7, but there's also a5. He plays a5 to later prepare knight c5, right? Here we go. What's the move for black? a4. And after a4 and knight d5, you tell me black's next move, folks. Yes, knight d7. We learned those chunks before in this episode. So here, black is still applying the same chunk. He doesn't take on d5 because that's only helping the white pieces. Can you guess? Space repetition. Do you remember the move here for black? Yes, folks. We go e5 and we are stopping this business. We are activating our queen and we are cementing our knight on d4 later on, right? Rook h3. What do we do? Can you remember? Of course, h5. You must stop queen h6 business. And the king is very safe in this position, folks. Knight c5 is very nice. Attacking the pawn on e4, but also preparing knight e6, d4 ideas. And already here, white is sort of in trouble. It's very difficult for them to defend the pawn on e4. That's why they are usually going for the pawn sacrifice f4. They need to create something on the king side, otherwise we win. But here black can safely grab the pawn on e4 and having an okay game. Yes, it might look a little bit dangerous on the king side, but everything is well guarded and your king is actually quite safe. Of course, calculation is also required, as always, but this is quite a nice position for black. And one final game to consolidate what we learned today, right? This again starts from this accelerated dragon structure, early g6, Maroczy Bind is on the board. See, there are different move orders, but black will show the same ideas. For example, here, he directly takes on d4, but we will soon achieve the same setup. Black knows which piece and pawn is going where, right? It's like we are looking at the same game. In fact, they're all different games, but since those universal plans are always implemented, it almost feels like we are watching the same game over and over again, right? Hence, looking at several model games in your openings to get those patterns and chunks, recurrent patterns and chunks, by always asking the why question. For example, right? Knight b7, we saw this before. We saw this idea before. Rook e3, e5, we saw it before. That's a different game, by the way. h5, we saw it before. Guys, watch this, and I will show you one more exercise right now, right? We are coming very, very soon. Knight c5, of course, we pushed a4 to make it difficult for white to play b4. Now the knight also has these ideas. The bishop sucks. And here comes my final question. Knight d5 is on the board, folks. Can you now tell me whether bishop takes d5 is a good move or a bad move for black, right? Don't blindly apply everything. There are always exceptions. Maybe it's a different position right now. So I want you to judge the exchange bishop takes d5. What is different? What is the same? Is it good for black or white, this trade? All right? What are you seeing in the resulting position, so to speak, if you ever take? This concludes today's episode. This will give you great patterns and chunks and useful ideas when you're handling those positions. You can now play safely in the accelerated dragon structures, but also against symmetrical English, you can achieve those structures with black. Yes, you're lacking a little space, but you have a plan to solve your space problem. Then you have a plan to organize your pieces, have the right exchanges to potentially achieve a great knight versus bad bishop scenario. White also takes risks, right? That's a big risk for them to keep playing with that terrible bishop because lots of endgames are bad for them, right? So minority attack plan on the queen side, all these ideas, defensive ideas also on the king side, everything I gave you today in this episode will be useful for you guys. I want you to tell me your feedback. Do you take these structures with black? Do you ever have similar ideas and patterns that you implemented in your games? Is it the right way to learn our openings, do you think, right? I'm expecting your feedback. I truly believe in those important patterns and chunks that has higher chance of occurrence, but they also connect to strategy, right? Piece trades and the explanations why that trade is good or bad, potential endgame transformations, because this way you are not only learning that opening, you're actually becoming a good chess player. Hence, biggest buck for money, right? Or how does it go? Basically, this kind of training will make you a great universal player if you deeply engage with the material, folks. I hope this was useful. Now go and crush those people who like to take the Maroczy Bind and they claim space is everything. Think again.